So good evening, everybody. Welcome to our April 1st. It's not April Fool's here tonight. We are actually having a session, although Laura did have a little bit of trouble tonight. But I want to welcome you all to our SALT Talks. It's the first one for April, and this is actually our final month. We'll have 4 this month, and then we'll be breaking for the summer, giving you guys a chance to get through all your activities with the summer and, all the summer activities. So tonight, I did share in the chat box that Laura Drake, our guest speaker tonight, she'll be talking about special needs trust and stable account. Kind of like what's the difference between them? They're both some sort of savings account. Do they work together? Do they not work together? So those are some answers we want to get to the bottom of tonight and hopefully answer some of your questions regarding this. So I'm going to turn it over to Laura, and I guess you are good to go with your sound.
Yeah, I think so. Hopefully you can hear me just fine. And I'm going to just be there's something wrong with my computer, so I have to use AirPods to talk to you guys. And I don't use AirPods, so I'm going to hold this thing next to me so it doesn't come out of my ear. So I'm just going to be like I'm on a movie set constantly the whole time. Hi, everyone. We can go on. My name's Laura Drake, and I work with Community Fund Ohio. And tonight, the purpose of the presentation is to talk to you about how you can set money aside to help your family member even after you're gone, and how to save money basically for someone, even if they come into a back award or a large sum. And at the same time, the purpose of all that is we want to keep their eligibility for Medicaid and potentially SSI. Though I do like to point out that for most of you, when you pass away, your child, when you retire or when you pass away, whichever comes first, your child will probably leave SSI and go on to SSDI. And so maintaining SSI isn't always your biggest concern, but leaving a large sum for your child is usually a big part of your concern. So that's the goals of the presentation tonight. That's what we're going to talk about. We're going to, and Patty's going to be my little pointer. So next slide. All right. So Community Fund Ohio, we're a nonprofit. We were actually created up in Cuyahoga County, but it serves the whole country, the whole state, not the whole country, the whole state of Ohio. And I think 80 of the 88 counties funded Community Fund, the creation of Community Fund. And that happened in 1992 when a law was passed that allowed special needs trusts to exist for people who had disabilities but maintain their benefits. So Community Fund is actually the trust advisor, and we hire the trustee, who currently is Huntington Bank, which is nice because they're centrally located. And you can check out our website, communityfundohio.org. We're updating our website, which should happen very soon. So if you don't like it today, check back in about 8 weeks. It should be totally different. I've seen the mock-ups for it. So I'm here on behalf of Community Fund, but I always like to point this out. This is a presentation for your information. I'm not trying to sell you Community Fund. I don't get a bonus if you do a Community Fund trust or not. And so the purpose of this is to teach you about estate planning. I'll talk to you about times when Community Fund is definitely not appropriate. It's just what we try and do is act as a resource for families. And that's my role, is to be a resource for families. So you can always reach out to me now in the future if you have questions. And like I said, we'd love it if you use Community Fund, but I've often told families, oh, we're not appropriate for you. You need to look at a different option, because it's the purpose is we want to make sure you and your children are in the best position going forward. So that's a little bit about us. Next slide. And as Community Fund, our goal is to enhance the quality of life of people with disabilities. And we do that by offering a mechanism for family members to leave money for them so they can have choices in the future. And at the same time, we're going to safeguard their eligibility for any kind of government benefits. So next slide. So when we talk about government benefits, we are talking, there are different types. First, there are things that are not means tested, which means they can have an unlimited supply of money. So Social Security disability insurance is one that's based on someone's work history. And that's usually when we talk about it, when you've heard it up till now, it's you're out there working, you fall at work or someplace else, you can't work anymore, you qualify for Social Security disability insurance. And then that amount, the amount you get out is based on how much you put in. And that's the whole, and I actually knew somebody this happened to. They were like an investment guy and they had property and over $1 million in a retirement account. And at the age of like 40, he was in a horrible car accident. He was in a bicycle and he was hit by a car. His family was actually told he died. They got in the plane thinking they were collecting his body. And when they got there, they were like, oh no, he's not dead. And but it was kind of like that. And so he's actually doing fairly well, but he can't handle his own money anymore, right? And so he's on SSDI. Well, he doesn't have to spend down all his money. He gets to keep all that. So Social Security disability is it's a reward for people who've worked. Well, like I said at the beginning, when you go on retirement, your kids go on SSDI also. So they changed as long as they were disabled before they were 18. Medicare is something that's eligible for people who get Social Security disability after after a 2-year waiting period, and Medicare is available for anyone, regardless of what your assets are. You can be eligible for Medicare if you're eligible for SSDI, right? Now, if I have income, if I'm getting SSDI, so my brother got SSDI, but he also used to walk dogs, right? So he would take care of people's pets, and he would report that to Social Security. And if he earned too much money, his SSDI payment would drop for the month that he earned too much money. All right. Okay. So the next slide. When we talk about means tested benefits, we're talking about Medicaid and SSI, right? So Medicaid is considered like the payer of last resort, and it's not just health insurance. People think it's health insurance, but most of you should know now, Medicaid are the waivers, right? And in our world, we care about that self, the help, and the IO waiver. And so to be eligible for those, we need to have less than $2,000, and it usually hopefully you also have other health insurance. So your child might get your health insurance until they're 26 years old, but they still might want Medicaid, and that will cover the difference between the copays and deductibles and things like that. But additionally, we'll want Medicaid for the IOA for waivers and services. We also see Medicaid when we are senior citizens, right? And we need to go into a nursing home. That's another time we get Medicaid. And actually, this has been coming up recently with a lot of people who don't have relatives available to care for them. They've been moving into assisted living facilities, and assisted living facilities, they will take, there's an assisted living waiver. It's a Medicaid waiver. And so it's kind of an option for people who are fairly high functioning, but so they don't want to necessarily go into a group home. It's an alternative for that, one that's might be a little bit more active than a group home. And so they get the assisted living Medicaid waiver, and that pays for them to live in an assisted living home. So that's an option too. Personally, I am waiting until I can move into an assisted living waiver, because assisted living facility, because they clean your room for you, they have meals for you, lots of them let you have pets. I feel like it's heaven. That's what I've decided. Sorry, I just can't help it. I'm like, oh, that sounds nice. So anyway, so we think those are the other types of Medicaid that we have. SSI, or supplemental security income, is support for people who have never technically been able to provide for themselves. So it's the option for people who need to go, who possibly never worked or worked for very short periods of time. And this is for people. It's Patty, if you ever can't hear me, just like start waving phonetically, because the I'm not used to the AirPods, whatever they're called. So It's like a weird echo, and then it goes away and it freaks me out. So anyway, so the supplemental security income, it's that support for those who can't support themselves. That's kind of the basic concept for it. So this actually the maximum amount is not updated. It's basically $1,000 a month now. I apologize. I thought I updated everything, but it's pretty easy to miss things. Every year the amounts change a little bit, so it's around $1,000 a month now that SSI pays. Still, given that housing and things have increased, it's not very much money. Um, it's a token really, and but it's to provide for it gives a source of some income for people. So again, if I'm getting SSI and I also get a job at Kroger bagging groceries, I can actually earn quite a bit for about a year before that's going to impact my eligibility for SSI, and then my income might lower my SSI. I cannot stress this enough. Who cares? Yay. Basically, for every $2 I earn in the real world, I'm going to lose $1 of SSI. But the thing that matters most about this is I'm building up my eligibility for SSDI. And that's crazy important, because if I can qualify on my own for SSDI, I can get Medicare significantly younger than I would if I had to wait until my parents retire, or sadly if they pass away, right? So, and I still am going to be under my parents' coverage potentially, so there's still huge benefits, but we want to get that income on our own. And again, for every $2 I make, I'm going to lose $1. And that's after a year. It's not right away that happens. So it's really still very much so worthwhile. All right, so let's go on to the next slide. Sometimes people do this and they have cash and they hide it, and I cannot stress this enough. That is fraud. Please do not do that. That is a criminal act. And I personally get calls about this as an attorney, and they'll say things, and they'll say like, oh, well, they put the money in my account so no one would know. And I'm like, okay, that's a crime. You can't do that. And the problem is they do know. It comes out because there are two problems with that. One, there oftentimes is a record that has your child's social security number attached to it, and when that comes out, then you've got a huge problem because you've committed fraud. The other problem is that you think you're protecting their money, but then something happens to you, and now their money is getting divvied up between multiple people, or you've been in a car accident. Now their money is subject to attachment for something that they didn't do. There are so many ways to protect your child's money. There is no reason to hide it. There just is no reason to do that. So the other thing we would see people used to do is they buy a lot of gift cards and things like that. Those are, it doesn't matter how you have the money. Money is money. And so value needs to be reported to Medicaid. And so, again, separating it, changing it, putting cash under the mattress, all of this is rife with problems. And it could potentially, they could lose their benefits with long look back periods and penalty periods. And then if you're the ones who's actually filling out the applications for them, or documenting things, and they determine that you knew that this was false, then that is criminal. So you have to really be careful about that. Please don't do that. There's no need to do that. Is the reason there. Now, if somebody has like a short surplus, they get a bonus at work or something like that, and they get a $5,000 check from grandma or something. You're like, what am I supposed to do with this? You can spend that money appropriately. So they can own a car in their name, and you're like, well, they don't drive. Well, it doesn't really matter. They can own a car in their name. You can prepay burial. And you can prepay parts of it or all of it. If you decide you want to bury them or buy a niche or something like that, you can pay for those in bits and pieces. You want to make sure that whoever you're doing that with is experienced with Medicaid. And honestly, in Ohio, I haven't seen any issues with that. I will say we had somebody who wanted to pay for somebody to be buried in Kentucky, and it was a nightmare. They did not seem to understand what we were doing. But in Ohio, if you tell them it's a Medicaid situation, they know the language to use. You theoretically could pay the money to Medicaid. I don't know why you would, but you could. But you can put the money into a stable account or a special needs trust, right? So stable account has some limitations. Special needs trust as to how much you can put in. Special needs trusts do not. Okay, so let's go on to the next slide. And so the thing about Medicaid, it's true, is when we talk about whether or not they have money, how much money they have, this $2,000 ceiling. The big question is, are these assets accessible? Can they be turned readily into cash? So if I'm working and I have a 401k at work and I'm still in that job, as long as I'm working there, that 401k is not accessible. And so that 401k can continue to grow. It will not impact the $2,000 ceiling. Another thing is back payments from Social Security. In theory, it's not supposed to impact the ceiling for 9 months. Be careful with that because for Social Security, it doesn't for 9 months. Sometimes Medicaid can get a little weird about it. But anything, any inheritance or bank account, that is exact. Those are definitely assets. Obviously, if mom dies today and it has to go through probate, the money is not accessible tomorrow. It's accessible to me after it's gone through the probate process. But if mom dies today and named me as her beneficiary on her bank account, then as soon as basically the death certificate has been issued, in theory, I can access that money. Um, any life insurance policy or annuities or IRAs. IRAs are weird. They're also technically not accessible if they're in a payout status. So if I have an IRA and I've now converted it to paying the equivalent of what the RMD would be, the required minimum distribution, which isn't until I'm 72, but I can convert it to that now. I can convert it to income and then protect the principal of the IRA. So but all of these assets, but if I can't do that yet, then all of these items are assets that might impact my Medicaid eligibility. And that's when we see people needing to create trusts because or fund a stable account because they've come into this money that is now considered an asset. It's an available resource, which is going to affect my Medicaid eligibility. So we can go on to the next slide, Patty. As a parent, your obligation to support your child ends at the age of 18, and you have the right to disinherit any or all of your kids. Once upon a time, in the 70s and even into the early 80s, but really not since then, it was basically said disinherit the child with a disability. Don't leave them anything. I say if you go to an attorney like that right now, they're a heartless cold person and fire them and find someone else. I don't understand that thought. There's no reason to do that. All of your children are equal and they can be protected equally. Though Medicaid will provide a lot for your kid, when you're gone, and the county DD services will provide a lot. That's not the same as them having the extras in life that your inheritance can provide them. And if you plan appropriately, your child can get the benefit of all that money, and whatever they don't need will go to your other kids. And Ohio and federal law both provide these options that allow you to plan and provide for that child for the rest of their life. All right, so let's go on to the next slide. When you're drafting a will, then you want to, you can now in Ohio, you can put guardians, even for your adult children, if they have a disability. So generally, when somebody needs a guardian, the family members are the first people who get to be guardian. And then they're given notice. They always are given notice. If you in a will or a power of attorney have said, I want so-and-so to be my child's guardian, that gives weight, which it wouldn't otherwise for an adult child, but it does. So, and if they left the state, it's really handy to name all these other people. We don't, technically, Ohio isn't supposed to name people out of the state to be guardian, but they do now, actually, quite often, even without this. But we really strongly recommend in a will you put down who the guardian should be. You can, if you're going to disinherit your child in the will, it should say that. Again, I don't agree with that. Generally, my recommendation often is an equal share for each child. Some parents with a lot of wealth will not do that, and I get that. Their argument being their child with a disability doesn't need that much money. Especially I've seen that with autistic children who don't like to leave their shelter. They don't. So then really what they're going to need is money for root canals, clothing, things like that. And then the parents are like, well, we're not going to tie up a third of our wealth. If we have 3 kids, we're not going to do that. And so they come up with an amount they're comfortable with. And a lot of this is also, you have to think, some of it you have to take into consideration, how old are you? And then when one spouse dies, reevaluate. It can't be guaranteed that they won't die simultaneously, but most people do not die simultaneously. So that's something to think about too. Um, Now, if you decide that, hey, you know what, I would like to leave, I'm not going to give my money to my child with a disability. Instead, I'm going to give it to my typical child. Please, dear God, don't do that. What happens is the typical child, if they pass away, their spouse gets the money, who is not related to your child with a disability, or their children get the money. And if they're minors, there's no they couldn't give the money to their aunt or uncle even if they wanted to, because they're minors. And if they're not minors, if they're adults, you don't know that they're going to do that. Also, if you leave this to the typical child, there's no guarantee that they will actually do what they say they're going to do. And if you're like, well, no, my child would never do that. My child would always take care of their sibling. This is my response to this every single time. Okay, sure, they're perfect, but what about their spouse? You don't know who they're being, you know, who's helping make the decisions after you're gone. And those people might really convince them to not do what they're supposed to do. So, that is a concern to me. The other thing I would say strongly is that if you are not in a position to create a special needs trust now, because financially you feel you can't afford it or something like that, in your will, you can give the executor the authority to create what's called a wholly discretionary trust. We'll come back to that later. You can give the executor the authority to create the trust for the benefit of your child with the special needs, so that you're not, they don't inherit directly, the trust inherits. You can basically punt and make the executor do this in the future. And we're going to talk about trust in a second. Maybe you can go on to the next slide, Patty. We always recommend that part of your process for estate planning be that you draft a letter of intent. And you can obviously just Google letters of intent. And it's a document that tells people about your child. And again, sometimes, and it's something you could kind of update every couple of years. What they enjoy, the foods they like, the places they like to go, who their friends are, if they have special things. Like I have a friend and she hates to wear anything but pure cotton. If she wears anything but pure cotton, she gets all itchy and gross and weirded out by it. And it's her little thing. It's a sensory thing for her. If you we all know, if we're getting Lauren a piece of clothing, we're getting her pure cotton. And that's important to know, though, right? I mean, so if that kind of information is in there, then whoever is in charge can refer to that and be like, oh, okay, that has to be part of the process of purchasing. Letters of intent are not required, but again, it's a great idea. Also, I think as a parent, it's a nice thing to kind of revisit things, and have an idea and keep up with what is their current wishes. Because the reality of it is, if you draft that when they're 5, it's going to be totally different than when they're 15. And it's going to be different again when they're 20 and 25 and 30. They're going to keep changing. And so it's important, I think it should be like, I don't know, annual, but at least every couple of years, put it in your calendar to remind you to look at the letter of intent and see if it needs to be updated or changed. All right, we're going to go on to the next slide. So now let's talk about trusts. Trusts are these documents. They provide flexibility and control. A little bit of both, all right? And they can last for a very long time. And I think people think of them as documents for the wealthy. And they aren't just for wealthy people. And when you have a child with a special need, you need to seriously consider a trust, because trusts allow you the ability to control the situation after you're gone. And they're also a way to give your child the benefit of money without giving them the money. Because remember, if you give them the money, then it's theirs and it impacts that $2,000 limit. But if they just have the benefit of the money, it doesn't do that, but they can still buy and use what they want. All right, so let's go on to the next slide. Mainly, we talk about testamentary or living trusts. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I messed up. There's a testamentary trust, and that's a trust that it totally, that's in a will. And so, like, if you came to an attorney and you're like, "Hi, my wife and I, my husband, my spouse and I, we just had our children, and they're 3 years old and 5 years old, and we want to leave them money, and we don't really know, we don't have that much money, and blah blah blah." Most attorneys would draft what's called a testamentary trust. And so it basically says, we're not going to do a trust right now. We don't need to. We're going to create a will. And if when you pass away, any of your kids are still under 25, we're going to keep the money in trust. And for people who die when their kids are 3 or 5 years old, that's probably pretty good. They're probably, when you figure out paying for college and all that stuff, that's probably about as long as most people's money is going to last. But then when the kids are older, when they're 16 and 17, or that's different. And then you might want to look at a revocable or irrevocable trust. So these are trusts that are now, they're in existence during your lifetime, because a testamentary trust doesn't even exist until you've passed away. So a revocable or irrevocable trust is drafted during your lifetime, and it's a separate entity. A revocable trust is an extension of you. An irrevocable trust is its own separate creature. So revocable trust, I can amend and fix anytime I want or change as long as I'm alive. But all revocable trusts become irrevocable when I die. So if I'm the trustee, if I'm the grantor and I pass away, my revocable trust now becomes irrevocable. It's unchangeable. Irrevocable trusts are also used when you're planning your estate for Medicaid. When you are afraid you're going to go on Medicaid, then you use an irrevocable trust. Otherwise, all the trusts that we're talking about really can be revocable until you pass away. There are also support trusts, which we don't see a lot of anymore. So I'm going to skip that. And then special needs trusts, which is what we're going to talk about tonight. So special needs trusts are revocable or irrevocable trusts that have a different standard of care. And so the standard of care is this idea, it's when you tell the trustee what you want done with your money. And usually the standard of care for typical families with typical kids is provide for the support, care, maintenance, education, and welfare of my child. Well, if you do that in a special needs trust, then it's called then that makes the trust an asset that counts towards your child's $2,000 limit. And so special needs trusts have a special standard of care in that they do not have a standard of care. That's the trick. All right, so we're going to go on to the next page. When you decide to have a trust, the first thing you have to figure out is who's going to be the trustee. So if you have an attorney draft the trust, they'll help you pick that person. Be afraid if they pick themselves. Like always, like, I don't want to do that. So and the other thing to me is I'm always a little bit worried when they say pick your oldest kid. So if your oldest kid is 42 years old and a financial planner, okay, pick your oldest kid. If your oldest kid is a 16-year-old, what? You don't know what they're going to be yet, right? And so you also have to be careful when you're picking your siblings. They're your age. So they're going to die around the same time as you do. So that's something. Now, obviously, if you're 26 or 36, that's different than when you're 66, but you still need to take that into consideration. And so you have to decide who your trustees are going to be. And it can be family members. But the more you have in the trust, the more skill you need. And that's kind of clear, right? If you hire a professional trustee, like a bank, they're going to be demand to be paid. And usually a professional trustee is going to get 2% of the principal value of the estate. So if I have $1 million in the trust, they're going to, I should not have, I don't know what 2% of $1 million is. What, 20 grand? Is that what that is? If I do $100, it's $2. Anyway, so if I do the math, anyway, so I always say if I could do math in my head, I'd have been a doctor. So so they're going to take 2% of the value of the trust every single year. All right, and that's okay. And then they might charge other additional fees for things like if they have to have an attorney review something, those are costs that'll be passed on through the trust. Pooled trusts are another option, and a community fund is a pooled trust. And a pooled trust, they have built-in trustees because they decide who that is. And the pooled trust, they take all the money and they pool it into one big account. And so then the trustee is investing all the money en masse. And as the value increases, people's shares proportionally increase. If there were losses suffered, their shares, they would proportionally decrease, right? And right now, most trusts are decreasing. The stock market is decreasing in this moment, and then it'll come back up again, right? So pooled trusts have much lower fees. So community fund, as an example, their fee is $500 a year, regardless of the balance, up to 50,000. So like, what is that, a percent? And then after 50,000, it is 0.25% on everything after that. So it's instead of 2%, it's 0.25%. It's much smaller. But that's because they're pooled, right? So they also they don't necessarily handle all the same things. So I've had people come in and say, well, we own a lot of a lot of land. We own a bunch of rental property, and that we want that money to fund our child's life after we pass away. Okay, you can't have a pooled trust do that, right? You're going to need a professional trustee who's going to be in charge of the real estate. Now, if you have one of the kids who's really overseeing all this real estate anyway, that might be fine that they be the trustee. But you're going to need somebody. You can't use a pooled trust to handle a bunch of real estate. They're not set up for that. Pooled trusts are set up to handle your finance, your money, not assets like that. So I come back to the same thing. Lots of people will say, I'm going to pick my typical kid to be the trustee. I just want you to realize one thing. I'm not saying it's the wrong decision. I mean, it is the wrong decision, but I'm not technically saying that. Here's why I'm not crazy about it. You have to remember that whatever is in this trust for the benefit of your child with a disability, whatever's in that trust when they pass away goes to your typical children. And so I think there can be a point, and I've seen it, where the kids feel like, well, mom and dad paid a lot more attention to my sibling because they had a special need and they lived with them a long time and they got a lot from my parents and they don't need any more and they don't really need this. And so I'm not going to I'm not going to give them this money. They don't need these things. And if I don't, then it benefits my kids, right? So there's a little bit there's not a little bit. That's a conflict of interest. And it's something you need to be willing to talk to them about and get an idea what they feel about these things. Because if they see the world that way, they will be happy to tell you that. Trust me. As a sib, I can tell you I have had that conversation. And so, you just need to be aware of it, right? If they see this as it's not fair, then they definitely shouldn't be the trustee because this is their chance to make it fair and it might not really be what you wanted. So be careful when you're picking a trustee. And if you can't have an open and honest conversation with your children about what their expectations are, if you feel they're holding back, they should not be your trustee. You can easily choose a professional trustee. You can choose a pooled trust. And yes, there's a fee to that. But their job is to make sure that your child with special needs gets the benefits they need, gets the money that they need to have the life they have. And so that's who you want to be in charge because that's the whole reason you're doing this in the first place, right? You're leaving them money so they can have more options. And so if you are worried that the other one's not going to do that, then you definitely should kind of step in and change your direction for that. All right, let's go on to the next slide. So you would always be the parent as the trustee to start. And like I said, you can choose the siblings. The other thing I like to point out, and I do say this as a sib, is that when you pass away, all of your children have just become orphans. And now many of your children are going to take a parental role for the child with a disability, while they're still in a parental role for their own children and potentially for their grandchildren. And they're probably still working, right? Because they're going to work until they're 65 or 70. And for anyone born after 1970, trust me, they have to work until they're 70 to get full retirement. So in their mind, I got to go until not 65, but 70. And so maybe you're asking too much of them when you're asking them to be the trustee. And they don't know necessarily the rules about Medicaid and SSI. some banks don't have great knowledge on disability related information. And so if you choose some banks, they're going to spend a lot of the money on the trust looking stuff up. Many of the banks like Fifth Third Bank and US Bank do have knowledge on that stuff. So that's different. So you really, if you're going to go with a bank as the trustee, you need to learn exactly what they're going. You need to sit down with them. You need to make an appointment with somebody and make sure that they know what they're doing, acting as the trustee of a special needs trust. And then a pooled trust, clearly they have specialized knowledge on this because all they do are special needs trusts. So, and the thing about the trustees on these things is there's the investment aspect of it, and that's a huge part of it because you want that to grow as much as possible. There is also the expending money out of the trust. You don't want them to spend money on things they cannot spend money on, because if they do, it can invalidate the validity of the trust. It can make it not a special needs trust. And that's why this knowledge about Medicaid and Social Security and SSI is so important. So, all right, so we're gonna go to the next slide. So when we talk about these trusts, if I'm the parent, if it's my money, it's not my child with disabilities money, I have two options. I can create a wholly discretionary trust, and there still exists something called a supplemental services trust. Anyone who recommends that to you as a trust, do not hire them. They're very outdated. I still see them get done sometimes, and I don't know why. Because they have a payback provision, so I don't understand why you'd use them. So instead, the wholly discretionary trust, I think, can you go to the next slide? I think that oh, can we go back? Sorry, we're gonna go back, sorry. A wholly discretionary trust, the whole point of that is there's no standard of care. And so it's entirely up to the trustee whether or not money is spent out of the trust, all right? And that's important because that means if the trustee has the final and last say, that means the county cannot force the trustee to pay for services that the county should provide. All right, a supplemental services trust does the same thing. It just has a payback provision on quite a bit of the money in the trust. So we don't like that. All right, so that's what we should, if you're planning for your child, you should be creating with your money a wholly discretionary trust. Now we're going to go on to the next slide. Now, if your child has money that's coming to them, and the reason that happens, like we said, Social Security back award, they inherit something from a family member, or they're in a car accident and they receive some sort of award for that. Or again, like they had an IRA at work or 401k at work and they stopped working. Now that's their money. And they're mainly, if it's over the stable limit, then they can only do a regular Medicaid payback trust or a pooled Medicaid payback trust. So the reason people choose regular Medicaid payback trusts, I never really totally understand why they do that. So because you're going to hire an attorney to draft the trust. And that can be kind of expensive. Whereas if you do a pooled Medicaid payback trust, at least with community fund, we require an attorney sign off on it. But it's still significantly less expensive because the trust exists and then you're just joining the trust. I have seen regular Medicaid payback trusts. Oddly, when I've seen them, there was no reason to do them. They were done, and I think an error, because it made no sense. And then when the person died, the money had to go back to Medicaid, even though it shouldn't have. It would not have gone back to Medicaid if that Medicaid trust, if the regular Medicaid trust, payback trust had been created. And I was like, why did you do that? So, there's some weird things that happen with those sometimes. So if, I'm not suggesting that you don't sometimes do a regular Medicaid payment trust. There are reasons to do them, but you have to really check your attorney on why they're doing that because it seems unnecessary to me. Both of these trusts, if I am a person with a disability and I come into money, in theory, I'm supposed to lose my Medicaid until I spend the money down. These trusts are both ways that I can put the money aside as a sort of savings account, right? And I can use that money during my lifetime. But whatever I don't use first has to be used to pay back Medicaid. All right. Again, because of stable accounts, these accounts now only come up if it's a larger sum of money. All right, we're going to go on to the next slide. The wholly discretionary trust, which we talked about earlier, it doesn't have the standard of care about support, education, maintenance, welfare. It also has to have a provision, which is called a poison pill. And basically what that means is somewhere in the trust, it has to say, if any state agency deems that this is not a good trust and this money is available to the beneficiary, to the individual with a disability, then the poison pill kicks in and the money goes to the next beneficiary. The trust dissolves and it goes to the other siblings, the grandkids, whoever it goes to. And because of that poison pill, Medicaid has no reason to go after it because they're not going to get the money anyway. But the advantage of all this is there's no payback provision. So when the person passes away, nothing goes to the state, it goes to your other heirs. But again, remember, a wholly discretionary trust, it was never the individual with disabilities money anyway. And that's a really important part of it. All right, so the next slide. A regular Medicaid payback trust, the beneficiary passes away and Medicaid says we're owed X number of dollars. And then if there's, let's say there's $100,000 trust and Medicaid says we're owed $60,000, the first 60,000 goes to pay back Medicaid. The rest of it can go to mom and can go to the beneficiary's heirs. But if the individual, let's say it was $100,000 and when they pass away, they owe Medicaid $300,000, they just take the $100,000. They don't come after anybody else for the other 200. Parents, grandparents, guardians, any of them can or the ward themselves, the beneficiary themselves, can create these trusts. The hitch on these is they have to be under the age of 65 when they create it for a private trust. That's a weird little thing, which doesn't come up too often, but every once in a while it does. All right, so let's go on to the next. The pooled Medicaid trust, it's pooled, the money is pooled all in one big thing, but each account is separate. Like I said, it's proportionate based on how much is there. So the same people who created the payback trust, the regular trust can create this one, and the individual themselves can create this. So the other thing about a pooled trust, if let's say I come into $50,000 and I know that I've already paid Medicaid, Medicaid's already paid over $50,000 to me in benefits, right? If I die, Medicaid's taking all the money. Then I might say, listen, my family's not going to get any of this money when I pass away. Medicaid's going to take it. So there are options that you can leave the money to certain charities or to the pooled trust themselves. So Community Fund has a grant, has a charitable wing, and so money left over in the pooled trust goes into our what's it called? I don't know. It's got some name, continuous trust, and we give out grants, a few $100,000 a year in grants, but to organizations and individuals for things like service animals, equipment, an upgrade, like some Medicaid will pay for a wheelchair that costs $8,000, but the wheelchair I really want is this one that costs $15,000. And so the trust will sometimes provide grants to get them up to that better trust, to the better wheelchair and things like that. So that's why one of the reasons some people will leave them to the pooled trusts. And pooled trusts provide a trustee. That's already taken care of them, so the families don't have to do that. We have to pick a relative. All right, let's go on to the next slide. So at Community Fund, we offer three main types of trusts. We offer what we call a master trust, which is the wholly discretionary third-party trust, right? So no payback. We also offer a pooled trust, which has the payback. Again, remember, that's just for the individual with disability, with disability, it's their money. And we offer what's called a roll-in trust, which is a type of pooled Medicaid payback trust, which they used to be really popular before stable account. The only time we see them now, and if we get a pooled trust, we go, why are you doing this? Because we don't, stable accounts are less expensive than us. So we will question why someone is using us if a stable would be more appropriate. And so what'll happen is, like, on day one, we get a trust for like $5,000. We're like, why are you doing this? You could put this in a stable account. And then they'll say, oh, well, we're waiting for the sale of a house. And so that's about to sell. And then we're going to be putting $180,000, and stable account won't take $180,000. So then now we know they've done the roll-in trust for Medicaid application. That's fine. So we have some partners, and hopefully that's about to get expanded, but there's several up in Cleveland, and Arc of Ohio is one of our partners. So, and so basically you can set up a trust with us and the money would not come to our charitable arm, but would go to Arc of Ohio instead. So, all right, so we're going to go on to the next slide. if you decided you wanted to go with a pooled trust like community fund, we have all our documents on our website. An attorney has to sign off on it. So we had someone who had like a relative who was a Canadian attorney, and we're like, okay, that works. Otherwise, but the point is that you need to have somebody else giving you that kind of legal advice to decide if this is the correct one. And then you submit the documents. If you have the money already, you pay it. A lot of the trusts are what we call unfunded wholly discretionary trust or master trust, which means they're part of your estate planning. They're set up, but that no money goes in them until you pass away. And then you select what we call a designated advocate. And that can be your child with a disability, but they're the ones who say, hey, the individual needs a new bed. They need a new sofa. They're going on a trip on Disney. And so that's the person who's kind of overseeing all this. And so that might be their sibling. It might be someone who works with them or a caretaker who used to work with them. There are nonprofits in all throughout the state who will do this and act as the designated advocate. They'll step in and provide that kind of assistance for them. So that's an option that you have with us. And in a private trust, if you went with a private trust, instead of a designated advocate, you often have what we call a trust advisor. So maybe I make Fifth Third Bank the trustee, and then, but I want my other children and cousins to be able to ask what the heck's going on, and so I make them what's called the trust advisor. And so same thing, they can be an advocate on behalf of the individual with a disability. All right, let's go to the next page. When you want a trust to pay out, it's up to the trustee to do that. So with a private trust, your kids, if you name your kids or a bank, they're the one that's going to make that request. With community fund, you send a written request. It usually takes about 2 weeks, but sometimes people want to buy a house or a car with the money in the trust, and that's allowed. But those big requests need a little bit more time. And then the job of community fund is to go through and say, hey, does this make sense? Is this allowed? And sometimes some of that also is a bit of like review, like why are we've seen this lately. So the beneficiary has always bought, women's size 10 clothing and size 8 shoes. And suddenly we're getting, and we get receipts for requests for reimbursement for size 12 men's work boots and 2XL extra tall shirts and size 42 long pants. We're like, what the heck is this? And they're like, our favorite is like, they're cross dressing. Well, why aren't they cross dressing in their own size of clothing? And then it's our job at that point to say, wait a second, what's really going on here? And we do take it seriously to say, we just bought this person a washer and dryer 6 weeks ago. Why do they need another washer and dryer? And then we can start investigating and see what's really going on, because we don't want the designated advocate to be taken advantage. We don't want the beneficiary's money to be used inappropriately. And so and we have done things. I mean, I have been involved in those situations where we're like, no, we're not paying this doesn't make any sense. But how is this benefiting the beneficiary? It's benefiting you. And sometimes that gets a little bit heated, but I mean, the point is, if it's really for the beneficiary, they can show that. And we're not trying to be mean about it. We're just trying to make sure that the individual's assets are used for them and not other people. All right. Now, in some things, like if they're paying for cable TV, you can set it up that it automatically pays every month for 6 months. And then we say, hey, did they order, is this still the same amount? Is there no back amount? Because maybe they ordered some pay-per-view and we didn't realize that and we're slowly catching late fees. But also to make sure, do they still have cable with that company? So we check those kinds of things. All right, so let's go on to the next page. So stable, we call them stable in Ohio's, but it's from the ABLE Act, achieving a better life experience. It was this federal legislation. It's like a 529 account. The earnings grow tax-free, and I can put $19,000 a year as of this year, as of 2025, into the account. And if the individual is working, I can put another $15,000. So I can put basically almost, I'm really bad at math, but I think that's $34,000 a year into the account. Again, if they're working, and if they're working and they're earning that kind of money, they're probably not on SSI, so it probably doesn't matter. But the issue here is that there are a couple downsides to stable. one, if I'm on SSI, if I hit $100,000, they would lose their SSI. All right. Now they can, if they hit $100,000 in stable, woohoo, they've saved 100 grand. They could always take that money and move some of it over to a pooled trust. And now they're still eligible for SSI. It's not an either or. These things work together, all right? And the advantage of the stable account is that special needs trust, the dirty little secret about special needs trust is you can't pay for housing. You can't pay for heat and electric, can't pay for water, trash, you can't pay the mortgage. You can't pay those things. Those are housing costs. And under the law that enacted special needs trust in 1992, you can't pay for them. But I can take money from my special needs trust and put it into my stable and now pay those same bills. So, and again, the money from a wholly discretionary trust can flow into a stable account. The money from a stable account can flow into a Medicaid payback trust. All right. Because in theory, stable accounts have a payback to Medicaid on the death of the beneficiary. That's all asterisk because nobody really knows if that's going to happen. So to my understanding is that to date, they've never paid anything back to Medicaid. I don't know if that's going to continue to stay the same, but that's what I heard the last time I heard anything from anyone in stable. So to date, they've found ways to not have to do that. All right, so let's go on to the next slide. When you look at stable, which is Ohio's able account, and if you're living in the state of Ohio, I don't know why you wouldn't use stable. The monthly fee is significantly lower than if you go to a different state. If you put money into your child's stable account, you get, I think it's $1,000 a year. I don't actually work for stable. So I think you get for every $1,000 you don't pay income tax on at least $1,000 of contributions. If you're married, I believe it's 2,000. I might be off there, but it's at least that. And it's one of the largest funded stable accounts in the country. So it's a very safe bet. So like I said, there are limits on the deposits. They if they have more than $100,000, they would lose their SSI. If they're not on SSI, we don't care. And there is this Medicaid payback. And right now, the rule is that disability has to have occurred before the age of 26. That is probably going to change. They've been changing that. They've been upping that every few years. So, and again, for most of us on this call, that doesn't matter. But if you had a child who was a veteran and who suffered, some sort of debilitating injury in a wartime situation, they wouldn't be eligible for a stable. But hopefully that'll expand. So these limitations on deposits, they don't exist in trusts. And so that's why stables aren't really an option for estate planning purposes, but day-to-day planning, they very much so are. So that's what I would say about that. They're really an important part of it. And again, stable accounts and special needs trusts go hand in hand. All right, and so let's go. I think there's only one real slide. So the other things you need to think about is if you're talking about leaving the family home, if you want your child to live in your house after you pass away, you need to make a plan for that. And I'm going to tell you right now, a pooled trust isn't going to be part of that, right? Because now we've got to fund that. You're going to need a private trust to take care of that. And if that's the goal, you really need to reach out and find an attorney who specializes in those things. Guardianship, I give a lot of talks about why guardianship isn't always necessary. There's a lot of alternatives like advanced directives, like powers of attorney and living will. But because of some stuff, and I mentioned this at the beginning, if you feel your child may need a guardian during their lifetime, you want to address that in your will or a limited power of attorney listing who you would want them to have as their guardian. If there's if you want a do not resuscitate order, that's something you should talk about with your doctor. And my understanding is the individual with a disability would have to sign off on it. And then I would like to point out that in Southern Ohio, there's something called Plan. It's also in Northern Ohio. Plan is an option, is a nonprofit that kind of steps in and answers the question, who would take care of my child after I'm not here anymore? They're not DD services. They're a separate organization that some people hire, engage to have a role in their child's life. All right, next slide. If you want to contact us, here's our information that you can reach out to us. That's my phone number and that's my email address. I'm on the right. Or you can always call our main administrative offices up in Cleveland, in Middleburg Heights. They're not in Cleveland. I just always say that because, anyone from the south of Ohio, anything north of, I don't know, something is basically Cleveland. So you can feel free to reach out anytime and ask any questions. And I welcome you to go look at our website. It has a lot of information. And like I said, if you wait about 4 weeks, it'll have even more information. We've been taking stuff down as we're migrating to the other one. So are there any questions that I can answer anybody?
So,
I
so
know it's a
far,
lot of information.
I don't see any questions in the chat. And we had a link there to this presentation. Michelle, you can drop it in the chat box again. One question I had, and then I'm going to turn off the recording so people can just open up their mic and ask questions if they'd like as well. So you had mentioned the trustee. What it was Huntington Bank. How often does that change? Like in a pool, in generally, like a trustee,
In a
like
pool
with,
trust.
yeah. How
So
often?
since 1992, we're on our fourth trustee.
Okay.
So not very often. It's and we have, it's usually we've changed, not usually, we have always changed because the fee structure changed. It was going to be too expensive. And so we've sought someone else to work with. And we've been with Huntington now for, I want to say, about 5 years. I think I know it was before COVID. Um, COVID has changed all time concepts. So, so yeah, that's about right, 5, maybe 6 years. So, we've had, like I said, very long-standing relationships with all of them. They've approached the 10-year mark before we've looked elsewhere. So they usually they're fairly long standing. And so far it's my understanding it's going really well with Lincoln. So we do like that they're centric. Before they were all based in Cleveland. Even if it was Fifth Third Bank, which is technically Cincinnati, they were doing them out of Cleveland. And so the checks took forever. And for Southern Ohio, they never got them. But now that they're out of Columbus, it's really nice because everyone in the state gets them pretty quickly. So
Okay, thank you. I'm going to turn off the recording because I know there should be some questions on this. If you have a question, um, feel free to ask. But thank you, Laura, for
no problem.
talking on this topic. I can't tell you how many times I've heard this, and I mean, for those who are attending, the parents, it gets difficult to follow when you're not around this like all the time or just reading on it or studying it. It's still one of those challenging areas that we have to look at. So 1 second, I just want to thank Laura again for speaking and those who attended. I'm going to go ahead and close the recording so that we can speak freely and you don't have to worry about the recording. 1 second.